At 02:17 a.m. on June 9, 1944, 3 days after D-Day, a British field hospital near Bayeux received 214 wounded men in less than 4 hours. The medical staff had been awake for 36 hours straight. Blood covered the canvas floors. Morphine syrettes hung from every medic's belt like metallic fruit waiting to be picked. In the chaos of triage, where screaming dissolved into numbness and prayer became reflex, one man made a calculation that would haunt military medicine for decades. His name was Private Edmund Harwell, 23 years old. A pharmacist's assistant from Manchester before the war taught him that measuring life and death could fit inside a syringe. He had gentle hands, his commanding officer once noted, and an almost religious attention to detail. The kind of man who labeled every bottle twice and checked dosages 3 times before administering anything stronger than aspirin. But on that night in June, under the weight of exhaustion and the metallic taste of fear, detail became the enemy of speed. The German counteroffensive near Comas had produced casualties faster than ambulances could carry them. Men arrived in pieces, wrapped in field dressings that had turned from white to rust. The triage system collapsed under sheer volume. Critical cases mixed with those who might survive if treated within the hour. Morphine became the only mercy anyone could offer immediately. Pain management before surgery, comfort before death. The line between the two blurred in the candlelit shadows of that overcrowded tent. Harwell worked the medication station. His job was simple: prepare syringes according to the doctor's orders, hand them to the nurses, document every dose in the logbook. For 29 hours, he had done exactly that. 1/4 grain of morphine sulfate per syrette, standard dosage, enough to dull agony without stopping the heart. He had prepared 417 doses since midnight. His hands moved on autopilot now, guided by muscle memory and the fading hope that dawn would bring reinforcements. But at 02:17, something changed. A supply truck arrived with replacement medical stores. Among the crates, morphine ampules marked in metric units instead of grains. The new shipment used milligrams. Harwell saw the difference. He noted it. He even mentioned it to the nurse beside him, a woman from Edinburgh who hadn't slept in 2 days. She nodded, exhausted, and returned to holding a soldier's hand while he died. The conversion should have been simple. 1/4 grain equals approximately 15 milligrams. Harwell knew this. He had memorized the conversion tables during training. But exhaustion is a kind of paralysis that masquerades as function. The brain continues working while the synapses misfire. Numbers twist. Decimal points drift like smoke. He calculated the conversion in his head. 15 milligrams per dose. But the ampules contained 100 milligrams per milliliter. In his fatigue, he confused the concentration with the dose. Instead of drawing 0.15 milliliters, he drew 1.5, 10 times the intended amount. 150 milligrams of morphine sulfate per syringe, enough to suppress respiration in a healthy man, lethal in soldiers already compromised by blood loss, shock, and trauma. He prepared 20 syringes before the doctor called for them. Harwell handed them over, one by one, to 3 different nurses rotating through the critical ward. The injections were administered within minutes, intramuscular, into shoulders and thighs, wherever uninjured flesh could be found. The morphine entered bloodstreams already struggling to carry oxygen. Within 8 minutes, the first soldier stopped breathing. Then the second, then 6 more. At first, the medical staff assumed the wounds were simply too severe. Men died in field hospitals. Death was expected, even with treatment. But by 0240, 12 patients had slipped into respiratory depression simultaneously. Their chests rose and fell in irregular stutters, pupils contracted to pinpoints, skin turned the color of wet concrete. The pattern was too uniform to be coincidence. The head surgeon, Captain Thomas Ridley, noticed it first. He had been stitching a shrapnel wound when the nurse beside him called for assistance with a patient whose breathing had become shallow and labored. Before he could respond, another nurse shouted the same. Then another. Ridley dropped his instruments and moved through the ward, checking pulse rates, examining pupils, listening to the wet rattle of failing lungs. Morphine overdose. The diagnosis arrived in his mind like a bullet. But how? The doses had been carefully measured. He trusted Harwell implicitly. The young medic had never made an error, never confused a label, never rushed through protocol. Ridley moved to the medication station and found Harwell still preparing syringes, his face blank with exhaustion, his hands moving in mechanical rhythm. The captain picked up one of the prepared doses and held it to the light. The syringe contained nearly 2 full milliliters, far more than any standard dose. He looked at the logbook. Harwell had documented each preparation meticulously, noting the new metric ampules, recording the conversion. But the mathematics were wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Ridley didn't shout. He didn't curse or seize Harwell by the collar. He simply placed one hand on the young medic's shoulder and said, in a voice that barely carried over the groaning wounded, "Edmund, stop. Put down the syringe." Harwell looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, distant, as if viewing the world through gauze. He didn't understand at first. Then he saw the captain's face and the syringe held between them like evidence. Realization arrived slowly, the way dawn creeps across a battlefield, illuminating the cost of the previous night. "How many?" Harwell whispered. 20 doses, Ridley said. All administered. Some patients received 2. The tent seemed to contract around them. The sounds of suffering faded into a high-pitched ringing that filled Harwell's skull. He looked at his hands, still holding an empty syringe, and saw them as foreign objects, tools that had betrayed their purpose. If you're finding this story as gripping as we intended, consider subscribing to our channel. We bring forgotten moments of history back to life, revealing the human stories behind the machinery of war. Every week, we uncover another chapter of courage, tragedy, and the impossible choices that defined a generation. Your subscription helps us continue this work. The next story could be the one that changes how you see history. The medical response was immediate, but futile. Ridley ordered Morphine, an opioid antagonist recently introduced to military hospitals. The supply was limited, enough for perhaps 30 doses if rationed carefully. The nurses administered it to the youngest soldiers first, those whose bodies might fight back with enough vigor to survive. The drug had mixed success. Some patients showed temporary improvement, gasping back to consciousness before slipping under again. Others showed no response at all. By 03 a.m., 23 soldiers were in deep comas. By 0400, the number had risen to 37. The overdoses affected men differently, depending on their injuries. Those with head trauma succumbed fastest. Those with abdominal wounds followed. Men with limb injuries lasted longer, their bodies fighting the morphine's suppression, even as their organs began to fail. Harwell stood in the corner of the tent, his back against the canvas wall, watching the consequences of his error unfold in real time. Nurses moved between patients, checking airways, adjusting positions to prevent aspiration. Doctors shouted orders that had no solutions. Morphine overdose in healthy individuals could be managed, but these were not healthy men. They were soldiers torn open by high explosives and machine gun fire, their bodies already depleted of blood, their systems shocked beyond normal resilience. The captain assigned 2 medics to monitor Harwell, fearing he might harm himself. But Harwell didn't move. He simply watched, his face empty of expression, his mind cataloging every labored breath, every seizure, every moment when a patient's chest stopped rising and failed to start again. By dawn, 41 men were dead. By noon, 73. The deaths continued throughout the day in slow, irregular waves. Some soldiers lingered in comas for 18 hours before their hearts gave out. Others died within minutes of the injection, their compromised bodies unable to process even a fraction of the overdose. The military investigation began immediately. Captain Ridley submitted his report by 1600 hours, documenting the sequence of events, the dosage error, the attempts at reversal. He did not attempt to shield Harwell from responsibility, but he also did not condemn him. The report noted the extreme conditions, the lack of sleep, the inadequate staffing, the confusion caused by changing pharmaceutical standards during wartime. Harwell was removed from medical duties and placed under observation. He did not speak for 3 days. When questioned by the investigating officers, he answered in monosyllables, confirming facts without elaboration. Asked if he understood the gravity of his error, he nodded once. Asked if he felt remorse, he said nothing. The silence was answer enough. The final death toll reached 207 soldiers. Not all deaths could be directly attributed to the morphine. Some men would have died regardless, their wounds too severe for any intervention. But the overdoses accelerated deaths that might have been prevented. Men who could have survived with proper treatment slipped into comas instead. The morphine, intended as mercy, became execution. The British Army quietly revised its pharmaceutical protocols. Metric and grain measurements were no longer permitted to coexist in the same facility. All dosages were standardized. Double-checking became mandatory for any controlled substance. Training programs were expanded to include fatigue management and error prevention. The changes came too late for the men who died in that field hospital near Bayeux, but they saved countless others in the months and years that followed. Harwell was not court-martialed. The review board concluded that the error, while catastrophic, resulted from systemic failures rather than negligence. Exhaustion, inadequate supervision, poorly labeled supplies, and the chaos of wartime medicine all contributed. Prosecuting one medic would not address the deeper problems. Instead, Harwell was reassigned to non-medical duties. He spent the remainder of the war as a supply clerk, managing inventory far from the wounded. He never spoke publicly about what happened. Letters to his family were brief and factual, mentioning only that he had been transferred. After the war, he returned to Manchester, but did not resume his work as a pharmacist's assistant. He took a job in a textile factory, operating machinery that required no decisions about life or death. He married in 1947, had 2 children, and lived quietly until his death in 1983. His obituary made no mention of his wartime service. Captain Ridley continued working field hospitals until the war's end. He was decorated for his service, though he never wore his medals. In post-war interviews, he spoke about the challenges of military medicine, the impossible choices, the weight of command. He never mentioned Harwell by name, but in a 1962 lecture at the Royal College of Surgeons, he said, "We ask young men to make life and death decisions in conditions designed to break the human mind. Then we act surprised when they break. The miracle is not that mistakes happen. The miracle is that they don't happen more often." The 207 soldiers were buried in military cemeteries across Normandy. Their graves do not indicate cause of death. The official records list combat wounds, infections, and complications from surgery. The morphine overdose remains a footnote in classified medical reports. known only to researchers and historians who dig deep enough into the archives. Before we close, I want to invite you to be part of this community of remembrance. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the cost of war, then please subscribe. We're building a library of the untold, the forgotten, the stories that textbooks skip over. Your support means we can keep digging through archives, keep bringing these voices back to life. Next week, we'll explore the engineer who saved thousands of lives with a single piece of wire. You won't want to miss it. The tragedy at Bayeux teaches a truth that military academies still struggle to articulate. War does not only kill through bullets and bombs. It kills through exhaustion, through systems stretched beyond capacity, through the slow erosion of judgment that comes from asking the impossible of ordinary men. Edmund Harwell was not evil. He was not careless. He was human, placed in circumstances that made error inevitable. The morphine sat in those syringes, clear and measured, looking exactly like salvation. Harwell prepared each dose with the same careful hands that had served hundreds of patients without incident. The only difference was a decimal point, a moment of confusion, a brain too tired to catch what the eyes could no longer see. 10 times the dose, 150 milligrams instead of 15. The mathematics of tragedy are often that simple. The soldiers who died did not know they were dying from mercy. Most slipped into unconsciousness, believing they were finally being granted relief from pain. In that sense, perhaps, the morphine fulfilled its purpose. It ended suffering, though not in the way anyone intended. The comas were painless. The deaths, for most, were quiet. If there is any grace to be found in this story, it exists in those final moments when agony gave way to silence. But grace does not absolve. The fact that the deaths were gentle does not make them acceptable. 207 men who might have lived did not. Families received telegrams. Mothers wept. Children grew up without fathers. The ripples of that night in June spread across decades, touching lives that never knew the cause of their grief. Harwell carried those 207 names for the rest of his life. He never forgot a single one. In the quiet of his later years, working in the textile factory, he would sometimes pause at his machine and see their faces, young and broken, trusting him to take away their pain. He had done exactly that. And in doing so, he had taken everything else as well. The story ends where it began, in a field hospital at 02:17 a.m., before the error, when everything was still possible. Harwell stands at the medication station, preparing syringes with care and precision. His hands are steady. His mind is clear, despite the exhaustion. For 29 hours, he has done everything right. In 60 seconds, he will make a mistake that will define the rest of his life. But in this moment, before the decimal point shifts, before the morphine enters the first vein, he is simply a young medic trying to save lives in a war that devours them faster than medicine can respond. That is the portrait we must remember. Not the villain, not the scapegoat, but the human being crushed between duty and failure. War creates these moments. It places ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances and demands perfection from those who are barely surviving. Sometimes they succeed. Sometimes they don't. And sometimes the difference between the two is so small it can be measured in milligrams. The morphine tragedy at Bayeux remains one of the darkest chapters in British military medical history. It is taught in medical schools as a case study in systems failure and human error. It is referenced in pharmaceutical safety protocols. It is whispered about in military hospitals when discussing the importance of rest, clear labeling, and redundant checking systems. But it is rarely told as a story, rarely given the human dimension it deserves. We reduce it to lessons learned, to protocols improved, to statistics that make the horror manageable. We forget that behind every number was a man who trusted the needle, a medic who measured the dose, and a moment when everything went irrevocably wrong. This is their story, not sanitized, not simplified, not reduced to a cautionary tale or a procedural error. This is the story of what happens when war asks too much of those who serve it. This is the story of 207 soldiers who died in their sleep, and one young man who spent the rest of his life wishing he had died with them. The sea was quiet again. The war wasn't.